Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the past, back to a time where a golden mid-frothy beverage was more than just something to enjoy after a long day. Picture yourself walking through the bustling streets of ancient Mesopotamia. The air is warm, thick with the scent of barley and wheat. In front of you, a grand temple rises, its pillars etched with ancient symbols and images of gods that seem to watch over everything. And in the hands of the people around you, clay mugs filled with beer, an essential part of their lives. You probably won't survive this ancient world without it. At least, not for long. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, don't forget to share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fun to see how far our stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Beer. Today it's a staple of bars, parties, and chill nights with friends. But in ancient Mesopotamia, it was something far more sacred. This wasn't the type of beer we're used to, though. In fact, Mesopotamians didn't sip on cold bottles after work. They drank a thick, almost porridge-like concoction made from fermented barley. Beer wasn't just something to unwind with after a long day. It was medicine, a remedy, and even a gift from the gods. The earliest evidence of beer production in Mesopotamia dates back to around 4000 BCE. The Sumerians, one of the first great civilizations in the region, were the ones who began brewing this mysterious liquid. They had the perfect recipe for a good life: barley, water, and yeast. All the basic ingredients for one of the oldest and most enduring beverages on the planet. Beer wasn't just for drinking. It was consumed for its supposed health benefits. In fact, it was often given to the sick, the elderly, or anyone in need of a good health boost. So, in a world where medicine was largely unrefined and full of superstition, beer was revered as a cure-all, used to treat everything from digestive issues to headaches. Historians still argue about the exact medical properties of ancient beer. But one thing is clear: it wasn't just a drink, but an essential part of the Mesopotamian lifestyle. Imagine the Sumerians using beer not just to unwind after a long day of work, but as a way to soothe their ailments, calm their nerves, and even please the gods. Yes, beer was so important that it was considered to be a gift from the divine. When you're sick or feeling a bit off, maybe it's time to reach for that cold one in your fridge. But in Mesopotamia, a cool mug of barley goodness could be all you needed to feel better. Now, let's talk about how beer wasn't just something people drank. It was a key player in ancient Mesopotamian medicine. If you were lucky enough to live in this ancient civilization, you'd probably find yourself drinking beer not for fun, but for your health. Sounds odd, right? But in a time without antibiotics or even basic painkillers, beer was the go-to solution for many ailments. In the early days of Sumer, beer wasn't just a recreational beverage. It was also a staple in the medical toolkit. Mesopotamians believed beer had healing powers, able to treat a variety of conditions, from digestive issues to minor infections. Historians still debate whether beer's medicinal properties were more placebo or if it actually had some scientifically beneficial effects. Still, it's widely accepted that beer was seen as a way to soothe the body, not just a treat for the thirsty. Picture this. You're an ancient Sumerian with a stomach bug, and the local healer, who's probably a woman, more on that later, offers you a mug of thick, sour beer. It might sound odd to you, but to them, it was a common cure. Some believe the fermentation process in beer created beneficial probiotics, which, even though they didn't know what they were, may have helped the body's digestive system. And let's not forget the fact that alcohol itself was thought to be a powerful agent for numbing pain. Beer was also seen as a tool to strengthen the immune system. In a time when herbal remedies and primitive surgery were the extent of medical practices, a drink that could settle the stomach, numb the pain, and perhaps even give your body a little extra resilience to disease was highly valued. There's also evidence that the beer brewed in ancient Mesopotamia was often mixed with other herbs and spices, creating what could be considered an early form of herbal medicine. The drink wasn't just alcohol and barley. It was a carefully crafted concoction, designed to do more than just make you feel good. It was a remedy for everyday life. Of course, there were limits to beer's medicinal powers. It wasn't going to cure everything, especially not the really serious stuff like broken bones or infections that could lead to death. But for more minor ailments, it was a go-to remedy that even the ancient scribes and doctors couldn't ignore. And, considering the lack of modern medicine, it was probably the best they had. In fact, some medical texts from the period actually recommended beer to treat conditions ranging from fever to poor appetite. Imagine a doctor today recommending a pint to fix a headache. You'd probably find that strange. But back then, it made sense. Historians still argue about just how effective beer really was in ancient Mesopotamian medical practices. But one thing is certain. The idea of a drink that could help you recover from illness was pretty revolutionary for its time. And while today's modern medicine has far surpassed those early methods, there's something poetic about the thought that something so simple, so widely consumed, could be part of the reason for healing in the ancient world. The fact that the Sumerians trusted beer as a remedy speaks volumes about the importance of this drink in their daily lives. As you sit back, sipping on your cold drink, it's hard to imagine beer as anything other than a casual companion for your night out. But in ancient Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just a drink for the masses. It was something that even the gods couldn't resist. And by gods, I mean the pantheon of powerful, capricious deities that ruled over everything from war to agriculture. Beer wasn't merely a human invention. It was a gift from the divine, and it played a key role in religious life. Let's start with the big guy, Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who was said to have given beer to humanity. If that doesn't sound like a god worth following, I don't know what does. According to Mesopotamian mythology, Enki was the one who taught humans how to brew beer. And what a generous gift it was. Beer, in the eyes of the Sumerians, was the drink that brought joy, unity, and spiritual elevation. So, it wasn't just a drink to enjoy with friends, it was a bridge to the divine. In fact, some ancient texts claim that beer was the drink of the gods, served at heavenly banquets. Imagine the scene, a glorious feast with Enki and his fellow gods, toasting with large goblets of the finest beer. Sounds like a party you'd want to attend, doesn't it? Historians still debate whether beer was seen as sacred or simply as a common offering. There's evidence that, during rituals, people would pour beer onto the ground as a tribute to the gods, essentially offering their drink to the heavens. This wasn't just a casual act. It was part of a complex religious practice that linked beer with spirituality. In some texts, it's even mentioned that gods like Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, were revered in their own right. Ninkasi's name was frequently invoked in hymns and prayers, with Sumerians asking for her blessing to produce good beer. Beer wasn't just for the gods and priests, though. It was an essential part of the rituals of daily life, and it bridged the gap between the earthly and the divine. It was said that, when brewing beer, people followed a series of sacred steps and chants, which imbued the beer with the power of the gods. Some even believed that the beer brewed in the temples had the power to transmit divine favor to those who drank it. So, while you might be tossing back a beer to watch the game tonight, ancient Mesopotamians were toasting to the gods in hopes of receiving divine protection and blessings. There's a certain magic in the idea that something as simple as beer could carry with it the power of the divine. Perhaps it's the idea that beer, with all its complex ingredients and fermentation process, symbolized life's mysteries. The ancient Sumerians saw it not just as a drink, but as a way to connect with the forces that shaped their world. For them, each sip was a reminder of the gods' generosity. And in a world where life could be harsh, unpredictable, and full of strife, the gods' favor was something worth celebrating. Beer in Mesopotamian culture wasn't just about having a good time with friends. It was about acknowledging the divine forces that influenced every aspect of life. And if that means a little divine intervention in your daily cup, well, I'd say that's something worth toasting to. Now that we've talked about how beer was seen as a divine gift, let's dive into its role in society. Picture it. You're walking through a bustling Mesopotamian city, where life revolves around the rhythm of trade, agriculture, and religion. And in the heart of this civilization, beer. It wasn't just something the people drank on the side. Beer was integral to daily life, to rituals, to work, and perhaps most surprisingly, to the very structure of Mesopotamian society itself. Beer, you see, was more than just a drink. It was a social binder. In ancient Mesopotamian culture, beer was often consumed during large communal feasts. These gatherings weren't just about sharing food. They were opportunities for people to come together, to bond, and to celebrate. The importance of communal drinking can't be overstated. Beer played a key role in creating unity among individuals who might otherwise never have met, fostering a sense of community. In these communal settings, beer wasn't just a beverage, it was a social contract. Sharing a drink was an acknowledgement of mutual respect, even among strangers. Historians still argue over the extent to which beer played a role in the political landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. Did beer help solidify the power of kings, or was it just something enjoyed by the common people, far removed from political intrigue? One thing is certain. Beer was a part of almost every social and political event, from religious festivals to state banquets. These gatherings, where beer flowed freely, were spaces where power and influence could be consolidated. For example, when a king hosted a feast, he might offer beer as a symbol of his generosity. It wasn't just about showing off wealth. It was about demonstrating a kind of divine favor, that the king was worthy of the gods' blessings and, by extension, the people's loyalty. But beer didn't just have significance in politics. It was also essential for the working class. In fact, beer was often used as a form of payment. Imagine being a temple laborer or a worker on a construction project, and instead of being paid in cash or material goods, you're given a pint or two of beer as your wages. While this might sound unusual to us today, in Mesopotamia, beer was a valuable commodity. This practice wasn't reserved just for the poor, it was common across all levels of society. In temples, the priests who brewed the beer were highly respected. Brewing beer was a sacred duty. and those responsible for it were seen as performing an important religious service. But the consumption of beer wasn't only a form of payment. It was part of the very fabric of daily life. From the elite to the working class. Workers drank beer during breaks to refresh themselves and keep going. Beer was hydrating and provided calories, and in an era where clean water could be scarce, beer was a safer alternative to drink. Historians have noted that some of the most famous Mesopotamian texts, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, also reference the centrality of beer to society. The epic tells the story of Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu, who, after becoming civilized, end up drinking beer together. This moment is crucial in the narrative because it symbolizes Enkidu's transformation from a wild man to a more refined human being. It wasn't just about becoming part of society. It was about sharing in its most basic ritual, the consumption of beer. Historians still argue about the role beer played in shaping the rise of the Sumerian city-states. Was beer consumption a key factor in building the civilization's sense of unity and identity? Or was it just one of many components of a more complex societal structure? Whatever the case, beer was a drink that transcended social boundaries. Whether you were a king or a common worker, a priest or a farmer, you shared in the same tradition. It's hard to think of any other drink that would have had the same unifying effect on an entire society. We've already seen how beer wasn't just something to drink in ancient Mesopotamia. It was part of life's very foundation. But beyond its social and spiritual importance, beer also had something else going for it. It was thought to be downright healthy. Picture yourself living in a time where clean water could be scarce, where diseases spread quickly, and where people had little understanding of what caused illness. It sounds pretty grim, right? But this is where beer, specifically the fermentation process, came into play, acting as a kind of ancient medicine cabinet. In the time of the Sumerians, many illnesses were believed to be caused by evil spirits or displeased gods. But there were also practical explanations for why people turned to beer as a remedy. You see, fermentation, the process through which yeast turns sugars into alcohol, wasn't just an accident of brewing. It was actually believed to have therapeutic effects on the body. Beer, particularly in its unfiltered form, was rich in probiotics, which can support gut health. Back then, however, people didn't have the scientific language to describe these benefits. All they knew was that beer could aid in digestion, ease stomach discomfort, and even relieve nausea. Historians still argue over how much beer was actually consumed as a medicinal remedy versus a recreational one. Was it really the beer's alcohol content that gave it its healing powers? Or was it the nutrients that came from the fermentation process? Some ancient texts mention beer as a treatment for ailments like indigestion, fever, and poor appetite, suggesting that it wasn't just for fun, but rather for practical health reasons. The Sumerians even used beer as a kind of tonic to fortify the body and help keep sickness at bay. Imagine the scene. You're feeling under the weather. Maybe it's a stomach bug, or you're suffering from the aches of a long day of labor. Your local healer, who's probably someone you trust, suggests a cup of thick, barley-based beer. It might sound unusual to us today, but for the Sumerians, this was a common remedy. The idea was that beer, with its fermentation process, could restore balance to your digestive system. Since beer was often brewed with herbs and other spices, it could be a little more potent than the modern, commercial versions we drink today. In fact, beer was sometimes mixed with medicinal plants, adding another layer to its healing properties. Beer wasn't just good for the body, it was believed to nurture the spirit, too. In ancient texts, Beer was linked with happiness and vitality, often associated with strength and well-being. So, if you were drinking beer in ancient Mesopotamia, you were not just quenching your thirst, you were taking part in an age-old practice of boosting both body and soul. Beyond its medicinal use, beer also had nutritional value. For workers, especially laborers who spent long hours building temples or working in the fields, beer provided calories and hydration in one neat package. It was far more than just a drink. It was fuel for the body. When you couldn't rely on bottled water or modern sports drinks, beer was an easy and effective substitute. And in an era where nutrition wasn't as refined as it is today, the simple act of drinking beer could help provide the energy needed to get through the day. Historians still debate whether the widespread belief in beer's medicinal properties could have been a form of ancient self-care, or if it was just a comforting placebo. It's possible that beer was seen as more than just a physical remedy. Perhaps it also served as a psychological comfort, especially in a world where so much was unpredictable and out of control. Maybe the belief that beer could heal you made it feel more effective, even if it was more about faith in the remedy than the actual science behind it. So, the next time you crack open a cold one, remember that you're drinking a beverage that has been a part of human culture for thousands of years. Whether as a divine gift, a social lubricant, or a powerful medicinal tonic, beer's place in the world is deeply rooted in history. It's not just about getting drunk or having fun. Beer was once considered a key to good health, longevity, and prosperity. By now, we've learned that beer wasn't just a drink of pleasure in ancient Mesopotamia. It was essential to the very fabric of society, spirituality, and health. But there's another fascinating aspect to beer's role in this ancient civilization that might surprise you. Beer was sometimes used as payment. Yes, you heard that right. While most people today expect to be paid in cash or goods, in Mesopotamia, workers often received beer as a form of compensation. Imagine working long hours on a construction project or in the fields, only to be handed a mug of beer as your wages. It wasn't just a little treat. Beer was considered valuable enough to serve as legitimate payment for labor. In Mesopotamian culture, beer was so highly regarded that it was used to pay workers in a variety of industries, especially those involved in temple work. Workers who helped maintain or build temples were often given beer as part of their salary. This might seem odd to us today, but beer was the essential drink for nourishment and survival, and it was considered both a nutritional staple and a form of currency. In fact, there are records of workers being given rations of beer as part of their daily provisions, especially for those who worked in large-scale public projects. Historians still debate the exact role beer played in the economy of Mesopotamia. Some argue that it was a practical necessity for workers, after all. It could keep them hydrated and energized, especially during long, grueling hours in the hot sun. Others believe that beer had symbolic value and that offering it as payment was a way of showing respect or gratitude to the workers. It wasn't just about giving someone a drink. It was about acknowledging their labor and ensuring they were properly cared for. In ancient Sumer, workers in the temples were seen as performing a sacred duty, so offering them beer wasn't just a matter of practicality. It was part of the divine favor. The beer itself was often brewed in the temples, under the watchful eyes of priests or priestesses who believed they were channeling divine power into each batch. This made the beer served to workers not just a simple refreshment, but a holy offering. It was believed that drinking this beer could confer blessings, prosperity, and even protection from the gods. It's important to note that the beer given to workers wasn't the same as the modern beer we drink today. In fact, it was a thick, porridge-like concoction, often consumed with a straw to help sip through the grainy texture. While the taste might have been a little different from what you'd expect, the beer was a highly valued commodity, rich in nutrients and calories. For a worker, receiving a beer ration was as much about sustenance as it was about reward. Beer wasn't just limited to the lower classes, either. Even the wealthy and elite had access to beer, though it was often served at larger feasts or religious ceremonies. Kings and queens were known to host extravagant banquets, where beer flowed freely as part of the celebration. These events weren't just about revelry. They were an opportunity to show off wealth, solidify alliances, and demonstrate divine favor. For those in positions of power, hosting these large feasts where beer was abundant could have been a way to demonstrate their generosity and their connection to the gods. In this way, beer became a symbol of both prosperity and political influence. Historians still argue about whether beer was used to directly support the economy or whether it was part of a more complex system of ritualized exchanges. What is clear, however, is that beer was indispensable in all facets of Mesopotamian life, whether you were a lowly worker or a king. It was part of the economy, culture, and daily survival. In many ways, the role of beer in Mesopotamian society shows just how central this drink was to sustaining life, not just in the physical sense, but in the social and spiritual spheres as well. Next time you reach for a drink, think about how beer, once the humble staple of ancient workers, was a form of currency, a tool of spiritual connection, and a symbol of prosperity all rolled into one. It's incredible how this ancient brew, so simple in concept, could touch nearly every part of life. Now, let's shift our focus a little. If we're talking about beer in ancient Mesopotamia, we can't ignore the process of brewing. The act of making beer was an art form, one that was closely tied to the culture, religion, and even gender roles of the time. In the bustling cities of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, brewing beer wasn't just a job, it was a sacred duty. And in most cases, it was women who held the keys to the beer-making process. Yes, the sacred art of brewing was typically carried out by women, often in the privacy of their homes or the sanctity of temples. Women in Mesopotamia played a vital role in the production of beer, as well as other staple foods. In fact, the goddess of beer, Ninkasi, was often depicted as a female figure, reinforcing the idea that brewing was deeply connected to womanhood and the feminine principle. The process itself was lengthy and labor-intensive. Barley would be soaked, fermented, and transformed into a thick, porridge-like beverage that could be enjoyed in various forms, depending on the region and the occasion. This was not the clear, cold beer you're familiar with today, but a rich, cloudy concoction that required skill and patience to perfect. Historians still argue whether beer brewing was seen as purely a domestic responsibility or a spiritual one as well. Some scholars suggest that women's role in brewing was seen as a religious act. After all, brewing beer often took place in temples, where the beer produced was dedicated to the gods. The act of brewing was infused with ritualistic practices and was seen as a way to honor divine forces. Brewing was done with a great deal of reverence, with prayers and offerings made to the gods, asking for blessings on the beer and the community. Imagine being one of these ancient brewers, stirring large pots of barley and hops, while chanting a prayer to Ninkasi or Enki. You were not only producing food and drink, You were participating in a sacred tradition that connected your everyday tasks to the divine. The beer you brewed wasn't just something to drink. It was a conduit to the gods. If you think about it, brewing beer was one of the few occupations that combined the mundane with the mystical. And it was women who were tasked with holding that balance. Beer brewing was often done in large, communal settings. Think of a bustling temple or a grand courtyard. There was a sense of community in the brewing process. As the work required more than one set of hands, women would come together to grind the barley, mix the ingredients, and monitor the fermentation process. But it wasn't just about labor, it was about camaraderie. This communal brewing was a social event as much as it was a productive one. One of the most interesting aspects of Mesopotamian brewing practices was the use of specialized tools. Large clay vessels were used to hold the beer, and straws were often employed to drink the thick, grainy concoction. The beer wasn't the filtered, smooth beverage we know today, but instead had a texture more like a liquid bread. Straws helped the drinker sip without swallowing the heavy grains, which could make drinking a bit of a challenge. This might sound a little strange to us now, but for the people of ancient Mesopotamia, it was a perfectly normal way to consume their beer. Historians still argue about the specifics of how beer was brewed in ancient Mesopotamia, with some scholars suggesting that the Sumerians were the first to develop the techniques that would later influence the brewing process in other parts of the world. What we do know is that brewing beer wasn't just a craft. It was a skill passed down through generations. In fact, brewing instructions have been found in ancient texts, showing just how highly regarded the practice was. So, the next time you enjoy a beer, take a moment to think about the women who were the original brewers, who, in ancient Mesopotamia, didn't just make beer. They helped sustain a society. Their role in both the kitchen and the temple was indispensable, and without them, beer might not have become the staple it is today. As we journey deeper into the world of ancient Mesopotamia, it's time to take a closer look at the daily experience of beer consumption. You can almost feel the warm Mesopotamian sun on your back as you picture yourself sitting in a bustling city like Ur or Babylon, watching the world go by. But unlike the cold, crisp beers we enjoy today, the beer of ancient Mesopotamia was a thick, almost soup-like beverage that was consumed in a manner very different from what we're used to. It wasn't about casually sipping. It was about nourishment, ritual, and, of course, a communal experience. Beer wasn't just something you drank for fun. It was essential to daily life. Whether you were a farmer, a priest, or a craftsman, beer was a significant part of your daily routine. It wasn't only consumed during social or religious ceremonies. It was part of every meal. Imagine the scene. You sit down for breakfast, and in front of you is a bowl of barley porridge and a large amtas clay mug filled with thick beer. It's not something you drink casually. It's fuel, hydration, and a ritual all rolled into one. Beer was consumed throughout the day, much like water or milk is today, and it was seen as the perfect drink to accompany meals. In Mesopotamian society, it wasn't unusual to see people drinking beer first thing in the morning, with the belief that it provided nourishment and energy for the long day ahead. Beer wasn't seen as something to be consumed exclusively for pleasure or relaxation. It had a functional purpose. In fact, there were even times when people were known to drink beer with meals in the middle of the day, not just to satisfy thirst, but because it was seen as a supplement to a balanced diet. Historians still argue whether beer's role in daily life was as purely nutritional as we believe, or whether it was more symbolic, a representation of divine favor, a drink of the gods. Was it more of a sustenance drink than a luxury? Was it more about connecting to the divine than about hydration or calories? While there's no doubt that beer had nutritional value, it's possible that, for many, the act of drinking beer was as much about culture and spirituality as it was about health. Despite its utilitarian role in daily life, beer was never consumed alone. It was always a shared experience, whether in the homes of commoners or the grand palaces of the elite. Beer was an invitation to socialize. It was a beverage that required companionship, that tied people together through the simple act of sharing. At public gatherings or feasts, beer was served in large communal bowls, and people would sip from straws, passing the drink back and forth in an unspoken symbol of unity and trust. It wasn't just a drink. It was a vehicle for connection. One fascinating aspect of beer in Mesopotamian culture was its association with both leisure and labor. Workers would often take a break from their tasks, sit down with a mug of beer, and relax. Given how physically demanding life was, particularly for those engaged in agricultural or construction work, this beer break was just as much about recharging the body as it was about enjoying a brief respite. In contrast to modern beer, which is often enjoyed for its taste and refreshing qualities, Mesopotamian beer had a different purpose. It was filling, hearty, and sometimes even more like a meal in a cup. It wasn't a drink you'd casually knock back while watching a sports game. It was something you'd savor, enjoy slowly, and perhaps even dip your food into. The grainy texture, coupled with the thick consistency, made it more of a supplement to the diet rather than just a thirst quencher. Historians still argue over the exact method of beer consumption. Some suggest that beer was primarily served in large communal vessels, and others believe it was distributed in individual clay mugs. Regardless of the form, beer remained a central feature of Mesopotamian life, consumed by all levels of society, from the lowliest laborer to the highest priest. No one was immune to the ritual of drinking beer. It's fascinating to think about how something as simple as beer could play such a central role in the everyday lives of people who lived thousands of years ago. From its spiritual significance to its nutritional value, beer was much more than just a drink. It was a connection to community, a link to the divine, and a part of life's basic rhythm. The fact that beer was so deeply intertwined with Mesopotamian society shows just how much we, as a species, have relied on this beverage to fuel both the body and the spirit for millennia. At this point, we've explored beer's role in the ancient Mesopotamian world as a medicine, a social glue, and a connection to the divine. But there's one more fascinating dimension to this story: beer's depiction in art and writing. This was a culture that didn't just make beer and drink it. They immortalized it in their most sacred art forms. Imagine walking into a grand temple or a palace adorned with intricate carvings, paintings, and reliefs. Among these depictions, you'd find images of people drinking beer, offering beer to the gods, and celebrating with it during grand feasts. Beer was so essential to their daily lives that it made its way into the very fabric of Mesopotamian art and literature. In the world of Mesopotamian art, beer was often portrayed in reliefs and carvings, with people drinking from large vessels or offering it to gods in grand ceremonial scenes. These depictions didn't just showcase beer as a drink, they illustrated its central place in religious and social practices. In these images, beer was shown as something sacred, revered, and even offered as an offering to deities. Some carvings even depict gods and goddesses enjoying beer, with vessels overflowing, signifying abundance and divine favor. It's clear that beer wasn't just a mundane drink to the Mesopotamians. It was a powerful symbol that reflected both their daily routines and their most important religious beliefs. Historians still argue whether these artistic depictions were meant to be literal or symbolic. Were these images of people drinking beer simply a reflection of everyday life? Or were they a divine exaggeration meant to elevate the importance of beer in the eyes of the gods? Regardless of the intent, it's evident that beer was deeply integrated into the artistic and religious consciousness of the time. The gods were seen as enjoying beer, which made it even more sacred for the people. By sharing in the act of drinking beer, the people were thought to be connecting with the divine, ensuring that the divine favor was with them. But it wasn't just in art that beer was celebrated. Beer also found its way into Mesopotamian literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest and most important literary works in history, references beer in a significant way. When the wild man Enkidu is introduced into the story, he is initially untamed and disconnected from human society. His transformation begins when he is introduced to beer. In fact, the very act of drinking beer symbolizes Enkidu's shift from the wild to the civilized. This moment is pivotal in the narrative, as it marks his entry into human society. So, in a way, beer becomes a symbol of civilization itself, a bridge between the untamed and the refined. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, beer is portrayed not just as a social drink, but as an essential part of becoming truly human. It's through beer that Enkidu experiences the joys of human society. And it's through beer that he becomes integrated into the broader world of the gods and men. This literary reference shows just how integral beer was to Mesopotamian culture, not only as a physical drink, but as a metaphor for culture, civilization, and even identity. Historians still argue over how beer was woven into the larger cultural and spiritual framework of Mesopotamia. Was it just a drink with symbolic significance in literature? Or did it reflect the core values of the culture as a whole? Whatever the case, the fact that beer was so prominently featured in both the art and literature of Mesopotamia speaks volumes about how deeply it was embedded in every aspect of life. Today, when we think of art and literature, beer is rarely the first thing that comes to mind. But in ancient Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just a part of everyday life. It was something that transcended the ordinary, something worthy of being immortalized in the greatest works of their civilization. Now that we've explored how beer was portrayed in art and literature, let's dig a little deeper into how the Sumerians and their neighbors actually made beer. We're talking about ancient brewing techniques that laid the groundwork for the brewing industry we know today. Of course, it wasn't the same precise, mass-produced beer we're familiar with. But the fundamentals of beer making in Mesopotamia were surprisingly advanced for their time. The process itself was more like an alchemical experiment than a simple brewing process. And much of it took place in temples or workshops dedicated to this sacred task. Mesopotamian beer wasn't brewed with the sophisticated technology we have today. But they did have some clever techniques for fermenting barley and other grains. At its core, the brewing process involved soaking barley in water, letting it germinate, and then drying it. The resulting barley mash would be mixed with more water, then fermented for several days. This process created a thick, viscous liquid that, while not exactly the clear and crisp beer we're used to, was packed with flavor and nutrients. It was often more like a porridge, consumed through a straw to avoid the leftover grains. Imagine taking a sip of something more hearty and filling than anything you'd expect from a modern pint, something that nourished and hydrated at the same time. Historians still argue about the specifics of the brewing process. Whether it was an art passed down from generation to generation, or whether it was controlled by the temples as part of their sacred duties. One theory is that the temples held a monopoly on beer production, with the priests and priestesses brewing the beer as part of their ritualistic responsibilities. Beer wasn't just a commodity. It was something created under divine guidance. In this sense, the act of brewing was seen not just as a practical task, but as something holy. As we've mentioned before, women played a significant role in brewing. This wasn't just because they had the necessary skills for cooking and food preparation. It was because brewing was seen as a domestic and sacred activity. Women, especially those in religious communities, were responsible for producing the beer that sustained everyone from the workers in the fields to the elite in the palaces. And while brewing might have begun in the home, it didn't stay there. As the practice became more institutionalized, temples and other public spaces became the centers of beer production. But the beer itself wasn't just made to satisfy thirst. It was made for various occasions. And the ingredients used in brewing could vary based on what the beer was intended for. Some beers were made with additional flavorings, like dates, spices, or herbs, which could give the beer unique properties. These added ingredients weren't just for taste. They were believed to have medicinal qualities, much like the beer's probiotic benefits. In this way, beer wasn't just one drink. It was something of a whole food, containing calories, vitamins, and nutrients to fuel the body. What's especially fascinating is how beer was considered a vital component of the Mesopotamian diet. In a world where food could be scarce, and the average person's diet was much simpler than today, beer acted as a significant source of calories and hydration. In fact, some historians suggest that beer may have even been more important as a daily sustenance than as a social or ceremonial drink. For the common person, beer could have served as both a meal and a beverage, a thick, nutritious drink that helped them get through their day. Historians still debate how much brewing knowledge was spread throughout Mesopotamian society. Did all of Mesopotamia use the same brewing techniques, or were there regional variations? We do know that different city-states had their own brewing methods, and these methods evolved over time. By the time of the Akkadian Empire, for example, beer had become more refined, though it was still far from the crisp lager we know today. Still, these early techniques were the foundation of the brewing industry that would eventually spread across the world. So, the next time you enjoy a cold beer, take a moment to think back to the Sumerians, those early brewers who laid the groundwork for one of the world's oldest and most enduring traditions. They may not have had modern brewing tools, but they sure knew how to create a beverage that was both essential to life and deeply intertwined with their culture, religion, and daily practices. As we continue to unfold the significance of beer in Mesopotamian life, it's clear that the drink wasn't just a functional part of the diet. It was a symbol of both prosperity and divine favor. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just enjoyed for its taste or nutritional value. It was imbued with symbolic meanings, representing abundance, good fortune, and the blessings of the gods. The importance of beer extended far beyond its use as a drink or a commodity. It was a representation of wealth, stability, and the community's connection to the divine forces that shaped their lives. Beer wasn't only for the common people. It was also a symbol of prosperity for the elite, for kings and priests. Beer was seen as a symbol of abundance and divine favor. In the ancient Sumerian city of Uruk, for instance, there are records that show beer was offered as part of grand feasts that were meant to demonstrate the ruler's wealth and his divine connection. Feasts weren't just for fun, They were political events where the ruler could showcase his generosity, consolidate his power, and ensure loyalty from his subjects. Beer, in this sense, wasn't just a drink. It was a way to demonstrate that the gods were looking favorably upon the ruler and his people. The more beer there was, the more abundant and blessed the kingdom appeared to be. Historians still debate whether beer's symbolic value was overemphasized or if it really was considered a currency of power in Mesopotamian society. Was it the drink itself that reflected the ruler's prosperity? Or was beer a mere backdrop to the larger political and social forces at play? Regardless of the specifics, it's clear that beer was seen as a vital part of Mesopotamian identity. The belief that beer could convey divine favor is part of a larger understanding of how the Mesopotamians perceived their relationship with the gods. Everything, from their crops to their drinking habits, was believed to be tied to divine will. And if you had enough beer to offer in abundance, you must have been in the good graces of the gods. But it wasn't just the rulers who benefited from beer's symbolic significance. In everyday life, beer was often associated with good health, prosperity, and good fortune. If you were a laborer working in the fields, you might not have had access to lavish feasts. But you could still drink beer, which was believed to sustain you, keep you healthy, and even bring blessings. The simple act of drinking beer, even during the most mundane moments of daily life, was believed to help protect you from misfortune. It wasn't just a beverage. It was a daily ritual that connected you to the divine. In temples, beer wasn't just served as part of religious offerings. It was part of the very rituals that ensured the community's prosperity. Priests would offer beer to the gods as a way of ensuring that their favor was returned to the people. This wasn't a casual gesture. It was seen as essential to the ongoing prosperity of the community. Beer was the offering of choice in many of these religious ceremonies, whether it was poured onto the ground in an offering or served in large ceremonial vessels. Through these rituals, beer became a physical manifestation of the people's desire to ensure divine favor, and in turn, their desire to prosper. Beer, then, was a drink that could transcend the ordinary. For Mesopotamians, it wasn't just something to be enjoyed with friends or drunk for health benefits. It was a symbol of the relationship between humans and the divine. In a society where every element of life was tied to religious practices, beer played an essential role in maintaining that connection. Whether it was used as an offering, as a sustenance drink, or as a way to mark a person's prosperity. Historians still argue about the exact role beer played in fostering a sense of community in Mesopotamia. Did it act as a form of currency in social exchanges? Or was it more symbolic in nature, representing the divine favor bestowed upon those who consumed it? Whatever the case, beer was a drink that transcended the basic needs of the body. It was a representation of life's abundance, a symbol of divine favor, and a social glue that tied the community together. Whether you were a common laborer or a king, beer was a fundamental part of how the Mesopotamians understood their place in the world. So far, we've explored beer's many roles in the ancient Mesopotamian world as a healing drink, a social tool, a symbol of prosperity, and even a divine gift. But what about the rituals and ceremonies that surrounded its consumption? Beer was more than just a drink. It was an integral part of religious and cultural life. It was consumed during sacred rites, offered to the gods, and used to honor the divine forces that shaped the Mesopotamians' lives. If you could time travel to a Mesopotamian temple, you'd find yourself in the midst of a rich, sacred atmosphere. where beer wasn't just enjoyed casually, but as a part of elaborate religious ceremonies. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer was not just something people drank for enjoyment. It was offered as part of religious sacrifices and rituals. Temples were central to Mesopotamian life, and the priests who worked there were often responsible for brewing and serving beer as offerings to the gods. These beer offerings were meant to ensure the gods' favor and blessings, as well as to maintain balance and harmony between the human world and the divine. But these were not casual offerings. They were highly ritualized, and the beer itself was treated with great reverence. One of the most fascinating rituals involved the use of beer in the context of temple feasts. These feasts were grand affairs, attended by priests, royalty, and the wealthy. They were seen as opportunities to honor the gods and solidify the community's connection to the divine. Beer was often poured in large ceremonial vessels, sometimes overflowing, signifying abundance and divine favor. In some cases, the beer was offered directly to the gods by priests, while in others, it was served to the people as part of a communal celebration. The belief was that by sharing beer, they were sharing in the divine blessings, and by consuming the beer, they were partaking in the spiritual nourishment that flowed from the gods. Historians still debate whether the consumption of beer during these rituals was purely symbolic or whether it was believed to have actual spiritual benefits. Was drinking beer during religious ceremonies seen as a way to connect with the gods, or was it more about receiving the physical and mental comfort it provided? While the symbolic aspect cannot be overlooked, it's likely that the act of drinking beer itself, especially in the sacred context of the temple, was also seen as spiritually fulfilling. To drink beer during a ceremony was to affirm one's place in the world, both as a member of the community and as a participant in the divine order. In addition to these temple rituals, beer was also part of private religious practices. Household altars often included offerings of beer, and family members might drink beer during personal prayers or celebrations. Beer, in these cases, was a way to honor one's ancestors and to invite divine favor into the home. It wasn't just about appeasing the gods. It was about creating a relationship with them, one that was built on shared food, drink, and ritual. Some of the most well-documented references to beer in Mesopotamian rituals come from the ancient texts themselves. For example, in the hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, beer is both praised and invoked as a powerful, life-sustaining gift. This hymn was likely recited as part of the brewing process, linking the act of beer production to the divine. The idea that beer was a gift from the gods, and therefore sacred, was central to the culture's understanding of both brewing and consumption. Ninkasi, in particular, was a goddess who embodied the connection between the human and divine worlds through the ritual act of drinking beer. Historians still debate the extent to which beer was seen as a mystical or sacred substance in these rituals. Some argue that the symbolic nature of beer in religious ceremonies was so powerful that it transcended its physical properties. Others believe that the belief in the drink's spiritual potency was part of a larger worldview that saw the act of drinking beer as a sacred event, one that brought people closer to the gods. Regardless of which interpretation is correct, it's clear that beer played a profound role in shaping the religious life of the ancient Mesopotamians. From temple feasts to private offerings, beer wasn't just consumed. It was an essential part of the spiritual fabric of Mesopotamian society. Whether in the grandest temples or the humblest homes, beer bridged the gap between humans and the divine, serving as a conduit for the gods' blessings and a reflection of the community's connection to the divine forces that governed their world. As we draw closer to the end of this journey through ancient Mesopotamian beer, we now turn our attention to how beer's symbolic importance played out in the realm of prosperity. Beer, you see, wasn't just a divine offering or a communal drink. It was also a reflection of wealth and status. In ancient Mesopotamia, the sheer abundance of beer was often seen as a marker of a prosperous and blessed life. It wasn't just about how much beer you had. It was about how much you could offer or share with others, demonstrating both your power and your divine favor. Beer was an important symbol of abundance, especially in a society where grain and food were often in short supply. The more beer you could produce and offer, the more it signified that you were on the receiving end of divine blessings. Imagine a wealthy noble hosting a grand banquet. The guests might not be drinking from delicate wine glasses, but from large clay vessels, filled to the brim with beer. The act of sharing that beer, pouring it for your guests, and celebrating with it, wasn't just a matter of hospitality. It was an expression of your wealth, your power, and your connection to the gods. In this way, beer wasn't just consumed for its taste. It was a tangible way to demonstrate your prosperity to others. Historians still argue whether beer's connection to wealth was purely symbolic or if it reflected actual economic power. Was beer, as a commodity, directly linked to economic wealth? Or was it more about what beer represented? Fertility, prosperity, and divine favor. While it's difficult to untangle the symbolic from the material, it's clear that beer was a key component in showing off one's success. In a world where the gods were believed to have direct control over abundance, the presence of beer, especially in large quantities, was a tangible sign that the gods were smiling upon you. Beer's symbolic connection to prosperity wasn't just reserved for the elite, though. Even for the common laborer, having beer was a sign of health and a certain degree of success. For the lower classes, the mere fact of receiving beer as part of their wages or at communal feasts was a reminder of the abundance they enjoyed in a world that could often be difficult and harsh. To drink beer, particularly beer that had been brewed with care, often in sacred contexts, was to partake in something greater than oneself. It was a connection to the divine and a sign of good fortune, even if your social status didn't match the wealth of the elite. The abundance of beer also had a more practical side. For those who worked in agriculture, beer was often consumed as a reward for their labor. It wasn't just a treat. It was seen as essential to getting through the physical demands of their work, and, like the elite, the common laborers could take pride in the beer they were given, not just because of its nutritional value, but because it was linked to the prosperity of the entire community. The very fact that beer was produced in large quantities suggested that there was a surplus of resources and that the community was thriving. Of course, beer's connection to prosperity also had a darker side. In times of famine or war, the absence of beer could be a powerful symbol of how far the community had fallen. The absence of beer could signify the collapse of a once thriving civilization. For the Mesopotamians, who believed that their prosperity was directly tied to the favor of the gods, not having beer meant that the gods' blessings had been withdrawn, leaving the community vulnerable to disaster. Beer was, in a sense, a barometer of a society's health and its connection to divine forces. Historians still argue about the deeper symbolism of beer's connection to prosperity. Some believe that the wealth tied to beer was merely an outward display of social status, while others suggest it was a form of divine communication, signaling the health of a community. Regardless of the debate, It's clear that beer wasn't just about quenching thirst. It was about symbolizing and ensuring prosperity. Whether it was in a grand feast hosted by a ruler or in the daily routine of a worker, beer was the drink that tied the community together, linking people not only to each other, but to the gods. As we approach the final chapters of this tale, we shift focus to a more subtle but equally important aspect of ancient Mesopotamian beer: its role in the transition from one era to another. As time passed, new civilizations rose and old ones fell. The influence of Mesopotamian brewing techniques, rituals, and the very culture of beer spread far beyond the Tigris and Euphrates. But with the shifting tides of history, the role of beer changed as well. The days of divine rituals, feasts dedicated to gods, and sacred brewing practices eventually gave way to the realities of empire building, political power struggles, and the growth of new forms of governance. The question is, how did beer, this enduring and essential beverage, survive and even adapt through all of this change? While Mesopotamian beer may not have been the same as the modern beers we drink today, the legacy of ancient brewing practices left its mark on civilizations far beyond Mesopotamia. As the Akkadian Empire rose and conquered large parts of the Near East, Mesopotamian brewing techniques spread with it. The ingredients and methods used by the Sumerians and Babylonians to make their thick, hearty beer were passed down and adapted by those who came after. This transfer of knowledge paved the way for the development of brewing traditions across the Mediterranean and Europe. Historians still argue whether the shift in beer's significance had more to do with the decline of Mesopotamian culture or with the evolution of societies that followed. Was beer's more practical use as a form of sustenance and trade the result of cultural shifts away from religious rites? Or was it simply the result of larger political changes that gradually made beer less central to the lives of the people? While we can't pin down the exact cause, we do know that the decline of the Mesopotamian city-states eventually meant a shift in the way beer was consumed. In the wake of the fall of Babylon and the rise of new empires, the practice of brewing beer continued, though it evolved to fit the changing political landscape. In ancient Persia, for instance, beer was still brewed and consumed, but it took on a more mundane role in society. Beer's divine association, once so central to the ancient rituals of Mesopotamia, became diluted over time, and it was consumed more as a common beverage, enjoyed by the masses rather than offered as a sacred offering to the gods. By the time of the Greek and Roman empires, beer was no longer considered a gift from the gods, but was still an essential drink for hydration and nourishment. These new civilizations adopted and adapted Mesopotamian brewing techniques, often blending them with their own traditions. The Romans, for example, had a beer-like beverage called cerevisia, which was made using similar methods as Mesopotamian beer. Though their version was a little less thick and porridge-like, it still carried echoes of the ancient brews of the Sumerians and Babylonians. Yet, despite the transformation of beer from a divine gift to a widely consumed commodity, the idea of beer as a symbol of abundance and prosperity remained. By the time the Roman Empire became established, beer was already seen as an everyday drink for the common people. It was cheap, easy to make, and widely available, though still far more common among the lower classes than the upper crust, who preferred wine. This transition shows just how much beer's significance had shifted from a highly ritualized and symbolic act to something more routine, a reflection of the everyday lives of the people, not the divine. Historians still argue whether beer's status was permanently diminished by the rise of new empires, or whether it was simply transformed into something new. Was the decline in beer's sacred role due to religious and political changes, or was it an inevitable evolution of a drink that began as a holy beverage and became part of everyday life? Regardless of the answer, one thing is certain. Beer's journey from ancient Mesopotamia to the modern world reflects the journey of civilization itself. From divine offerings to daily sustenance, beer adapted and endured, staying relevant through the rise and fall of empires, the changes in religious practices, and the shifting tides of history. Now that we've traveled through the rich history of Mesopotamian beer, we find ourselves at the end of this journey, where the story of ancient brewing and its profound impact on society continues to echo in the present day. While beer has evolved considerably since the days of the Sumerians and Babylonians, there's something timeless about this drink that continues to draw us in. It's not just about the drink itself, but about the shared human experiences it fosters. Whether it's an ancient ritual, a communal feast, or a casual gathering among friends, the legacy of Mesopotamian beer is all around us. From the way modern brewing techniques have evolved to how beer continues to play an important role in social rituals and celebrations. Whether you're drinking a craft beer with friends or raising a glass to celebrate an occasion, there's a deep connection to those ancient customs. The communal nature of drinking beer, the idea of sharing a beverage to mark a moment, is something that has been passed down through centuries, all the way from those early Sumerians who sipped thick barley brews around a fire. In the ancient world, beer wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol. It represented nourishment, spirituality, community, and connection to the divine. The gods themselves were said to favor beer, and through it, the Mesopotamians believed they could sustain their relationship with the divine and each other. As civilizations grew and changed, beer became more than just a ritual offering. It became a universal drink, one that could bridge the gap between the sacred and the mundane, the powerful and the everyday. The idea that something as simple as a drink could hold such importance, both physically and symbolically, speaks to the complexity of human culture. So, next time you take a sip of beer, think back to that ancient world, where beer wasn't just something to wash down food or unwind after a long day. For the Mesopotamians, it was a sacred drink, a tool for healing, a symbol of prosperity, and a way to connect with the gods. From the humble worker in the fields to the high priest in the temple, beer was a drink for everyone, and in its golden depths, it contained not just barley and yeast, but a piece of humanity's shared history. As the world continues to change, beer remains a constant. The ancient traditions may have transformed, but the joy of sharing a drink with others, of celebrating life's moments, and of coming together over something simple yet profound, endures. The Mesopotamians knew this well. Beer is more than just a drink. It's a symbol of life, abundance, and connection. Now, as we close this chapter of history, I invite you to relax. Close your eyes and think about the ancient world where the simple act of drinking beer brought people together in ways we still understand today. Whether in a grand temple or around a modest dinner table, beer was, and still is, a drink that nourishes not just the body, but the soul. It seems we've reached the end of our journey through the fascinating history of Mesopotamian beer. This script has explored the drink's origins, cultural importance, and how its legacy continues to shape societies today. It's been a journey that not only revealed the ancient brewing techniques, but also highlighted how beer was intertwined with the spiritual, social, and political aspects of life in one of humanity's first great civilizations. With that, we conclude our tale. But the spirit of Mesopotamian beer continues, lingering in modern times, shared across cultures and generations. Whether consumed for its health benefits, its divine connections, or simply for enjoyment, the essence of that ancient brew is with us whenever we raise a glass. Sweet dreams.